Okay, so it's not looking very good for Bernie Sanders. After the moderates coalesced around Joe Biden the day before Super Tuesday, Joe Biden won some amazing victories and Bernie Sanders underperformed. Bernie Sanders also did not perform well on Super Tuesday round 2. Now, the momentum is definitely in Biden's favor. Joe Biden also won 3 states recently. I think it was Florida, Illinois, and Arizona. And at this rate, Bernie's not going to get the nomination. So it's highly disappointing, and I think we'll cover that in a future episode, but I just wanted to share my thoughts on several topics regarding the election and left politics in general. So, a lot of progressives came to the conclusion in 2016, now again in 2020, that there should be a political party based on progressive or social democratic ideas, a working class agenda. Now, right off the bat, this makes sense. The Democratic Party is completely beholden to their donors, and the dominant tendency of the party is against Medicare for all. They're totally against a Green New Deal. They're against tuition-free public college, and so on. And, it seemed obvious to some people that there needs to be a new party that represents the interests of the working class person. Now, I personally believe that this is not a very good approach, at least for the current conditions. The reason is, I don't think the political system in the United States is conducive for the success of a third party. A lot of voters, they vote for someone not because they necessarily agree with all their policies, but they don't want to have the next guy get into office. So, you're voting for candidate A, not because you like them, but candidate B is just horrible and you don't want them to win. So you kind of have to do so what we have right now is just strategic voting by people, especially if you live in a swing state. You could say that the third party run allows someone to vote their conscience, which is, I think that's important. Now, that's fair. I understand that. I respect that. I would personally vote third party as well. But because people vote strategically, a third party would not get much success because your votes would be siphoned off from voting against the opposition. So not a lot of people are going to, necessarily support a third party, even though the ideas or the candidate is appealing. Now, this is a structural element of our political system that makes third party runs really, really difficult, unless you're just ridiculously wealthy, like a Ross Perot or a Michael Bloomberg, and you can bombard the airwaves with ads and gain support that way. But then again, if you're that insanely wealthy, and you can self-finance your campaign and, have a tons of ads and stuff, you probably won't support the interests of working class people anyways. Now, not only that, we have a first-past-the-post voting system. Now, let's just say you're voting for the House of Representatives. If that political candidate wins a majority, then they win the seat. Now, in places like Israel or Germany, there's proportional representation among seats in parliament. This way, smaller parties are much more viable because the more votes that a party gets, the bigger their share of seats in parliament. In the United States, because we're only voting for usually a Democrat or a Republican, people vote not only for a candidate, but to ensure that the other candidate does not get elected. And there's absolutely no reason to vote third party because at the end of the day, the person with the most votes wins, which denies the opponent getting the seat. Now, I'm sorry that I didn't explain that super clearly, but structurally, there's room for smaller parties in places like Germany or the Netherlands or Israel and so on. Their political system is just built that way, unlike ours. In addition to the structural elements of our political system making it difficult for a third-party run, you need the organizational capacity and an established network of supporters. This could take years and even decades to build. You need that base to really come out and support you, to vote for you, to spread the word. You need to organize, you need to host events, finance, etc., etc. And it's not a very easy task to do. Just take, throughout United States history, there's been dozens and dozens and dozens, perhaps even hundreds of parties. But have they gotten much success? No, not really. It's just been the Democratic and Republican parties. Now, sure, Bernie Sanders has won as an independent when he was in Congress, but he's one of the extreme few. Even he didn't decide to run as an independent candidate in 2016 or 2020 because, he admitted that it would be impossible to win. It's really easy to just say, yeah, let's just make a third party and run a really good candidate. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or like Ilhan Omar or whatever. Sure, you can pluck out a really good candidate, but you need a base that will come out to the polls for you. Now, I think that base is there because obviously Bernie Sanders is getting a wide swath of support from minorities, independents, young people, and disaffected and disenchanted voters. So I think the base is there, but in terms of building that infrastructure to reel those voters in as a third party, that's hard. So you need the capacity and the framework to really do that, and even to succeed at the local level. Now, the future of the left cannot only be about electoral politics, and I want to stress that. I think electoral politics is actually a dead end, since you're playing by the rules of the ruling class. Now, this doesn't mean abandon electoral politics altogether. There's a lot of good when we work in our local communities and our neighborhoods and our small towns and cities to build a left movement. Now, I don't claim to have a silver bullet or a master strategy that will be a magic pill that, solves all the issues. But I know that we cannot repeat 2016 and 2020 over and over and over and over again. The left, or those that claim to be progressive or social democratic or whatever, can't put all their eggs in the electoral politics egg basket. The media will always be stacked against us. And big dollar fundraisers aren't going to support a left-wing agenda. The only party that the left could go through, the Democratic Party, is completely hostile to left ideas and will and has cheated people like Bernie Sanders. Doing the same thing over and over and over while expecting different results is the definition of insanity. To say that we're running a new progressive candidate and we're building a movement every single electoral cycle is not the right move. And I personally think it's naive and even damaging in some respects because people are going to be discouraged from repeated failure. This doesn't mean we shouldn't support people like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or, Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib. We absolutely have to support them. Electoral politics can be a great vehicle for building up your organizational skills, for networking, for talking to like-minded individuals who are committed to the fight. There's a lot to be learned from participating and engaging with a political campaign. But what I'm saying is, the left cannot rely solely on electoral politics to gain power. Please, 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 do not fetishize the fight or the struggle. Some people just say things like, oh, if you're not going to fight, then, what? Oh my God, you just can't expect good things without fighting. Of course you have to fight, but you have to do it smartly with the right strategy and tactics. There's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned in victory and defeat. But like Michael Brooks said on his March 15th post-debate show, the left in the United States needs to be more strategic. We need to discuss what works and what doesn't work. And we have to be smart in how we do things. It's not just about these symbolic victories or moralistic victories of, oh, we tried or we worked hard or, I came out to the protest or whatever. But it's about actual discussion on tactics and strategies about how we can move the left agenda forward and to gain power, we actually have to talk about gaining power and exerting political pressure. Now, more broadly, the left needs to be an external force that is outside the realms of the Democratic and Republican parties. And that's what I meant by not relying only on electoral politics or on electoral politics at all. You don't need to rely on established political parties in order to get your demands through. Because if you play by the establishment rules, they're going to railroad you at any moment, just like they did with Bernie Sanders. The left has to set the agenda and, most importantly, dictate the terms of discussion by exerting opportunity costs on the ruling class. Now, of course, this is easier said than done, but you can't have a left agenda by playing nice to the ruling class, by brokerage politics or asking nicely. It must come through direct political action, independent from the electoral system. Now, Gore Vidal had an astute quote, and it went something like this. Quote, "The United States has one major party, the Property Party, and it has two right wings, the Republican and Democratic Party." End quote. Now, the functions of these two parties is to ensure that those on top are protected from whoever wins the election. The Democratic Party's function is to set the leftmost boundary for political participation and ideas and a gatekeep against any challenger from the left. So let me ask you, why do you have to play by their rules? Now, I also find it a bit amusing that progressive YouTube is advocating for infiltrating corporate media or being nicer to them so we can have lefty voices on mainstream news networks. There's that notion of, outcompeting corporate news or trying to influence the masses by being on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or whatever. Now, the notion of having to be friendlier to the establishment or to try to get on their good graces so you can get some airtime in is borderline absurd. Mainstream news will never, ever grant the left-wing legitimacy. That's not their function. This is a complete misunderstanding over the realization that corporate news has a huge influence on people. Okay, now I love independent media. I love TYT, Secular Talk, Jimmy Dore, Rational National. They're all great. However, I think this notion of trying to outcompete corporate media is just unrealistic. Firstly, establishment news is way too big and influential. You have newspapers, cable news, radio shows, and these are all owned by massive corporations that are there to reinforce the status quo and promote and legitimize capitalism. So not only that, but the establishment media is there to set the Overton window. They define the spectrum of acceptable political discussion. They're never going to say, they're never going to talk about Medicare for all in a nice way, even though all the studies point that it's going to save money and save lives. They're never going to talk about the ridiculous levels of income or wealth inequality or stopping our imperialist wars. Like I said, the media acts as the propaganda arm of the establishment, of the rich, of the 1%, of the capitalists. If they did talk about the plethora of issues affecting the United States like homelessness, poverty, inequality, healthcare, and so on, wouldn't you think that people would start questioning the government or the economic system that produced these results? Of course they would. That's why the media is against changing the status quo. They want to promote it because not only they have to protect the establishment, but they have to protect their own jobs and paychecks. And obviously, it's against their self-interest if they do that. Now, I talked about this at length in my previous podcast about establishment media and Bernie Sanders. So if you have time, please check it out. Now, again, the idea that you just have to be nice to, Chris Cuomo or, Chuck Todd so you can get on MSNBC or CNN, it's just fantasy. It's just crazy. Sure, they might have some progressive commentators like how Chris Cuomo has Anna Kasparian or Cenk Uygur, just to have a dash of diverse thought on the network. But at the end of the day, they're going to be promoting the status quo and promoting a pro-capitalist agenda by saying that we just need to be nice to corporate news or to or to try to get in their good graces. It just frames mainstream news as full of just bad actors that can and will change because we're nice to them. And that's not going to happen. These things are usually done in the back rooms or through hiring. I'm thinking about an Upton Sinclair quote, and I think it went something like this. Quote, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it," end quote. So, the managers are going to hire someone with an establishment viewpoint, who preaches conventional wisdom about politics, culture, and society, and are people that don't stray too far from the boundaries. Now, on my previous podcast about the establishment news, I talked about Ed Schultz getting fired because he wanted to cover Bernie Sanders, Phil Donahue getting fired even though he had a very highly rated show at the time, and an internal memo showed that it was because it was due to Phil's anti-war takes, and that it would be difficult to keep him around in a time of, where the United States needed people to be patriotic. Cenk Uygur got dismissed due to his deviant viewpoints, even though he also had a very popular show, and these are all well-documented cases. You think people like Tom Hartman, Abby Martin, or Chris Hedges would get picked up by CNN, ABC, or CBS? They probably wouldn't even get an interview. So this whole notion about trying to suck up to get a nice little spot on the establishment news is just naive and just kind of ignorant. Now, of course, you have to do what you can to spread the gospel of the left in whatever manner, or, whether it's through YouTube, blogs, websites, talking to people, and so on, but never rely on the mainstream news to give you an outlet to do so. I also found interesting that Andrew Yang endorsed Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden seemed to be everything Andrew Yang was fighting against. Andrew Yang talked about moving the country forward and tackling the issues of the 21st century, and one of his slogans was not right, not left, but forward. He talked about resolving the fundamental issues facing America and how people were struggling with opioid addiction, families were struggling to pay their bills and rent, they were struggling to put food on the table. He talked about automation and how people were losing their jobs. Yet Andrew Yang endorsed Joe Biden, who was for the status quo, who said that nothing would fundamentally change. It's really frustrating to see a candidate like Yang was really candid and seemingly very honest about things affecting average working Americans support a business-as-usual candidate. But if you think about it as a way to further one's clout or professional opportunities, then this was a smart move. If Yang is intending to run for a smaller office, or mayor, or, state senate or whatever, then having on the resume that he supported an establishment frontrunner would probably help him. It would certainly ensure that he remains on the good side of the establishment. That's kind of the nature of endorsements. I know I'm in the minority in this position, but I've always believed that endorsements should be genuine. You're supporting someone and attaching your name and your honor to this person because you believe in the policies and you share the same values. Now, unfortunately, endorsements nowadays, especially in DC politics, it's all about, cleaning up that resume. It's all about using your endorsement as a way to curry favor and to further your own political career. Like, hey, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and maybe you'll get a nice little spot at the administration if I win. I think that's just the nature of endorsements. Now, there was someone who I was chatting with that said that this was the right play for Andrew Yang, and then I mentioned that it was probably a good political move or career move for him too. Now, he quickly retorted and said endorsing Sanders wouldn't net Andrew Yang any benefit. But when I pressed him on it, he said that the Biden endorsement wouldn't actually benefit Andrew Yang. Okay, so which one was it? Not endorsing Bernie Sanders because it wouldn't have given Andrew Yang any benefit, or saying that the Biden endorsement doesn't benefit Yang? I might talk about Andrew Yang, another time, so I'm just going to leave it here for now. Now, if you're new to left politics, or just politics in general, it's really easy to despair. Not only is it easy to feel helpless and hopeless and powerless, but it's really easy to latch on to what seems like a political movement and say, this is it, we're going to win, we're going to defeat neoliberalism, we're going to do all these great things, blah, blah, blah. And, that was the story in 2008, 2016, and 2020. A lot of people were caught up in Obama mania. They thought it was a genuine political movement powered by the charisma of Barack Obama. And, same thing with 2016. People thought that, hey, look at this guy, Bernie Sanders. He came out of nowhere and won like 43% of the vote in like 22 or 23 states. And people were saying like, oh my God, neoliberalism is dead. And same thing in 2020. Some, people felt the same way. Like, oh, this is our moment. This is time where we defeat the establishment. But that's obviously not what happened. Now, I was optimistic too, and I don't blame people for feeling this way. People have been hungry for real change for a very, very long time. So I just want to end on this. As depressing and horrible as it may all seem, I like to think about Cornel West and what he has to say about being a fighter for justice and humanity. He talks about fortifying oneself. He talks about building fortitude. As a leftist, you're going to suffer defeats. A lot of defeats. But don't just, harden yourself and be pessimistic and cynical. You really got to prepare yourself mentally for these setbacks and just keep on fighting and powering through it. That's how the greats did it. We have to fortify ourselves and absorb the hits and strike back when we can. So don't ever, ever, ever give up.